I'm here today with Melinda Mack, and my name is Salvador Pina. I'm the chairperson of the Education Committee for the Northeast Economic Development Association, and we're here to chat a little bit about workforce development and economic development and talk about that nexus. So, Melinda, first of all, it's great to see you, and for those folks who might not have heard your presentation, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure.
So we can catch folks up.
Great. So thank you for having me. My name is Melinda Mack. I'm the Executive Director of the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals. We're New York State's Workforce Development Association. So what that means is we have membership that ranges from workforce investment boards to community colleges to K-12 institutions, community-based organizations, unions, you name it. If they do workforce, they're members of ours. What I talked about a little bit today was the importance of the connection for economic and workforce development. And I only had a few minutes, so I'm really glad we get to spend some more time together to talk a little bit more about the details.
Great, great. Well, you know, one of the things that I wanted to start off with is give folks a sense of the concepts that NEDA is using as they're moving forward with education for economic developers. And so we've sort of settled on a concept of economic self-sufficiency. And we view that in terms of sort of three major points. One is economic self-sufficiency for the community. So how do we build wealth for municipalities?
Yeah.
Second is how do we help businesses to gain wealth? And then third is look at the residents. And so as we identified this concept of wealth creation and economic self-sufficiency, I think one of the things we found is that businesses are really at the heart of it all.
Yeah.
And so I'm really eager to hear from your point of view about the kinds of concerns that you've heard businesses express and how workforce development issues play into that.
So it's interesting because I agree with you that economic self-sufficiency is at the heart of all of this. I think one of the things that I might differ on is that businesses are completely at the heart of it. I think one of the things that we recognize is that employers are a critical part or a critical element to the success, but they're not successful unless their employees are successful, unless their workers have the skills that they need to make the employer more profitable. And so I think in terms of the interconnection, one of the things we talked a little bit about earlier is the importance of understanding the employer and understanding what that employer is hoping to do in their current space, in their current economy, and what their growth potential looks like. Why that is important is because as you're thinking about lining up the resources, not just sort of the land, the water, all the things you need to do to have an employer be successful in the physical space, you also need to develop the human capital in a way that will allow the employer to grow and expand at the pace that they're expecting or exceed that expectation as well. So it's really interesting as you think about how those interplay. It's the employees that actually make the things that the employer is producing. But in addition to that, they're also buying the things that the employer is producing. And so again, that connection and relationship between the folks within the community and their sort of commitment to the employer is not only critical, it's also reciprocal. I think they're really interrelated.
Yeah, you know, I think you've touched on a good point because I think historically economic development has really been about land use,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And I know that as we've gone forward, we've begun to understand that there are a lot of national studies that reference on the part of employers that their major concerns really do lie with the cost of labor and the skills of labor. And so things like tax incentives and other kinds of incentives that you might provide employers, while they're important, they're not really at the heart of things. So tell me a little bit, first let's talk a little bit about how you come to know what employers' needs are, because I think that's different in the workforce development field than it is in economic development.
Yeah, so it actually it's talking to the employers. And so to give you a really concrete example, right now we're working with 9 food processors, so companies who make food in the state of New York. And we were sitting with them over a series of 3 meetings to talk really deeply about what are their current workforce challenges, what are their hardest to fill jobs, why are they so difficult to fill, and more importantly, where are they recruiting from? To start to get a sense of not only the mechanics of how the employer works, but what they actually need to be successful. But those conversations can go even a step further. We talk about the work environment, we talk about what it looks like within the plant, talk about skills that they may not have even thought about. One of the things we see, especially in an economic downturn, is the trend to having everyone needing a bachelor's degree in order to be able to work at this company. When in reality, many of the jobs actually need not much more than a high school diploma. So how do we help employers really hone in on what they need so that they can be as successful as possible? What that means in terms of the conversation is employers having to understand what they need. What we find, especially with smaller or mid-sized companies, they really struggle with actually being able to assess the workforce challenges and needs that they have as they grow as an organization. And so as a workforce organization, what we often do, or our members do, is they provide that recruitment arm for those employers, which not only saves those employers money, but it also gives them a better product. And when I say product, I mean the worker that would be working within that organization.
Yeah, so you've said two things that jump out at me.
Yeah.
One of them is that how do we help employers to understand their needs as they grow?
Yeah.
Because growing businesses obviously is about gaining wealth and creating opportunities for jobs. And then the second thing is that concept about, in downtimes the minimum requirements increase because the competition increases.
Is there. It's true.
Yeah,
it's economics at the heart of it, right?
Yeah. So what do you do in the workforce development system to help employers understand what they need as they grow?
So there's a lot of things that we can do. We use really traditional tools that I think both sides of the house use, which is labor market data, right? Labor market data analysis. We do worker surveys as well as employer surveys, right? Let's understand what the working conditions look like. And when I say conditions, I mean like, are you trying to do 16-hour shifts? Or what if you changed to 12-hour shifts and hired one more person? Would that increase productivity and increase retention? We also use a number of metrics that I think are really helpful for us to understand what's happening. We use recruit to hire ratios. So how many people do you need to interview before you hire one person? We use turnover rates to help us understand how quickly and rapidly there's folks turning over within an employer. Rapid turnover sometimes is built in, like the retail industry. It's very pyramid shaped with the bottom half with the expectation of rapid turnover. That's built into the economics of that industry. Other industries don't realize they're having that issue. They just think they're hiring the wrong people. And sometimes we can shift around other elements within an employer to be able to make that something that doesn't happen as frequently. Another good example, when I was working in the city of New York, we were actually working, this is during the great expansion of the city of New York, which seems, to recruit some really high-end grocery stores. They ended up raising their wage by 25 cents, and they ended up getting not only such better candidates, but their retention rates went way up, and it was for 25 cents. And what they found out was that the cost of that increase was actually less than what the cost was for the constant turnover that they were dealing with on a regular basis. So that's how we talk to employers about that kind of stuff.
And I think, you have similar challenges on the other side of the fence, I think, with workers, right? Because, and actually, let me even broaden that to say that we have that with training providers as well. So you've got workers who are looking for work but don't really understand the opportunities that are out there. You have training and educators and other training vendors that if they don't have strong relationships with businesses, aren't able to react fast enough to the marketplace. And so those two challenges, I think, compound the issues for employers, because as we look at workers who are trying to identify opportunities, the lack of the overall skill sets, which you hear employers talk about all the time, I think have a lot to do with them not understanding what the way the market's changing. Are there anything that you do in the workforce system that addresses that issue?
Yeah, so you actually brought up a really good point. I think one of the challenges we have is the speed at which we can respond to employer needs, right? This is a constant push and pull of economic and workforce development. A few things are changing in the field to better address that. I think one, because of this deeper communication with employers, we're recognizing the need for industry recognized credentials as stopping points or stackable credentials along the way to a much deeper credential. So for example, a 2-year associate's degree. What that means is the employer is getting a skilled worker at exactly the point that they need them, and then we're figuring out ways to reinvest in that worker to be able to get to that skill level. That's the ultimate requirement for the employer. There's a few things that does. I think one, it gives the employer the job seeker they need right away. Two, it also gives the job seeker an understanding of what that pathway looks like and what that investment will be in them as a worker. And then ultimately, both end up satisfied because they end up having a skilled worker who's getting on-the-job work experience. In addition to that, they're having the credential that's associated with that. So I think there's some transparency issues around what does the pathway look like and an understanding of that pathway, but it's also figuring out how you take the skills that are required for the job and breaking them up into small enough segments that you're able to get the workforce into the field much more rapidly.
Yeah, so you reminded me of a concept that's really prevalent in business, the concept of just-in-time just-in-time delivery,
Absolutely,
right? So
absolutely.
we've got a new term here, just-in-time training, right?
Yeah.
And I think that makes a lot more sense. Even this idea of sort of micro courses that you shrink down the training to what's needed, and I think that's an important piece. And from that, let me dovetail a little bit
Sure.
to a couple of let's go to the sort of polar opposites, right? You have the baby boomers who are sort of leaving the workforce, and they've got all of these skill sets that they're taking with them when they go. And you've got the millennials, we'll use that term, and those folks are coming into the workforce, and they've got a brand new set of skills. And I think one of the things I get really concerned about here is the transfer of knowledge, because in a lot of jobs, there's some fundamental basic knowledge that doesn't change, right? I mean, accounting, for example, accounting is going to always be accounting.
Yeah.
And some of the softer skills, I think that you see seasoned workers have, those things don't really change, but they still need to be taught.
Yeah.
But then you have this idea that as folks go forward and retire from the system, they're taking institutional knowledge away.
Absolutely.
And how do we look at that from your perspective, from the workforce development perspective?
So there's a couple of very specific terms that we use, from on-the-job training to work experience. What that really is meant to say is it's almost like providing almost every occupation that you can, like a residency, similar as you would in a medical profession, right? Like, or if you're a teacher, you get an opportunity to teach within a classroom, to understand the environment, learn classroom management, et cetera. Many of the jobs, especially in places like in fields like advanced manufacturing, would really incredibly benefit from the opportunity to have an on-the-job training experience where the actual trainer is someone from the company, because you're learning the specific technical skills and requirements that are specific to that employer. Again, the basics, so the ability to read blueprints, the ability to do metrology or sort of certain kinds of measurement, those are things that can be taught in school, but we know a lot of those workplace skills only occur on the job. There's a couple of modalities that you can use. Apprenticeships are really well known and are actually picking up speed again in this country. Apprenticeships are a long-term investment by an employer and a job seeker to think about that customized on-the-job training in conjunction with sort of educational attainment as well. But in the shorter term variety, there's on-the-job training where you hire someone with a specific thought or requirement that they would receive on-the-job training to do that job. Again, these are all things that can be customized through the workforce system. So if an employer came to one of our training providers that are our members or our workforce boards, they would say, what do you need? We can figure out a way to create it for you, because we know that it's often very employer focused.
Well, great. We've got a couple of minutes left before we have to close. And, I did want to just briefly mention your idea about, focusing on property owners as economic developers, and having them lead us to a greater understanding what the business's needs are. And in that context, I wanted to ask you if you would just leave us as economic developers with some thoughts on how you think workforce and economic development can better work together and advance some of these issues that we're talking about.
So I think I think the fastest way and simplest way to say it is figure out who has the best relationship with employers. Whoever has the best relationship with employers in that instance is the folks you need to be partnering with. Sometimes it's the workforce system, sometimes it's economic developers, sometimes it's very specific to a trade association. At the heart of all of the work that we do, it's the employers and the employer demand and meeting that demand that they have. And the modalities that we use to meet that demand are a little bit different, but as we work together to do that, I think that's where the employer and the community is more successful. One thing I mentioned earlier today was around thinking about property owners. I mean, they know their tenants incredibly well. Those tenants have a wealth of information around what they're trying to do. In that instance, that's the best place to go as a nexus of information that could bring both sides of the house together. The only other thing that I would mention before we close is the importance of not doing this after the employer has already come to your community. Workforce organizations can't just produce or give you qualified candidates on a dime, especially if it's a very specialized or technical skill set. We need the time to be able to get ready, and so as soon as you're even thinking about approaching some sort of employer or some sort of sector to grow in your local area, you should be working with your training providers and with your workforce boards and organizations, because they can then budget in funding for training. They can actually create or customize those courses on the on-front, so you have that skilled workforce ready for you when you arrive.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. It's been great, and I think this last piece about maybe maybe building teams in advance and making sure that both sides understand the assets and resources that they have available before, and putting that together in a package so that they
It's a
can
puzzle.
so they can present it to employers before they get settled. I think it's a
Absolutely.
good thing. So I want to thank all the folks
Thank you.
who are listening in on this today. Great opportunity to chat with Melinda, and we'll see you again sometime.
Thank you.
All right.